After week-long speculations, a new prime minister was finally announced last Monday afternoon. Elisabeth Borne is following Jean Castex at the Matignon Palace, Hotel Matignon, the official residence of the French prime minister. A couple of facts: she's 61 years old, only the second woman to enter Matignon after Edith Cresson, who became prime minister in 1991 under President Mitterrand. When Elisabeth Borne's name emerged last Monday, nobody was really surprised, since she had been on top of the list of the media speculations ever since Emmanuel Macron won the presidential election at the end of April. But President Macron took a lot of time to actually decide on his new prime minister, and the question why that is will probably be one that we will discuss. We want to discuss in the coming hour. His hesitance and the time he took was much criticized in France as political tactics. The president, such was a common reading, was trying to steal time from the campaign, and he did quite successfully so. Stealing time from the unfolding legislative campaign, the parliamentary campaign, as the media, that's true, was mostly speculating about names for the prime minister and the incoming new ministers these past days. Emmanuel Macron thus continued what he had done, again, very successfully in the presidential campaign, leaving ample room for speculations and discussions before then entering the debate as the president, very late, to maximize media attention for his decisions and, in a sense, control the public debate. Some commentators, however, and we might discuss this in the following debate, are fearing that Macron's success in terms of electoral tactics might turn out to be a strategic error, as it is further nourishing the sentiment in France and for the French electorate that everything is played, that everything is decided already, and that there's little to no room for real democratic debate. Now, while the presidential campaign was planned to come down or to galvanize around the duel Macron-Le Pen, the presidential majority now focuses on the candidate from the extreme left, who came third in the presidential race, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who managed to build a left-wing alliance, NUPES, together with the Greens, the Communists, and the Socialist Party in the meantime. And just to give you some figures, with 3 weeks to go before the first round of the Législatif, more than 75% of the French electorate seems to be decided, and these votes are largely divided between 3 blocks. First of all, the presidential majority around Renaissance, the president's party or movement, that polls at 28% roughly. Then the new Popular Ecological and Social Union, NUPES, that I talked about just now, which polls at 27%, so very close to the presidential majority. And then at the end, the right-wing Rassemblement National that polls at 21% currently. But be aware, these figures might not be very instructive since there's 2 rounds, as there is for the presidential elections, and the majority vote in the second round favors personal choices in a sense in the 577 constituencies that constitute the French National Assembly. So the final outcome might vary from these polls right now. A last bit of information, maybe some of the new ministers that we will talk about now, that were announced on Friday, are running in the election for parliament. If they fail to secure a mandate, they will probably step down. They will be expected to step down, at least, as is the tradition, the constitutional tradition. And as the government is not completely formed anyways, we can expect further changes towards the end of June. Now, with all this, let me come to the introduction of our panelists. I'm very happy to be joined this morning by Georgina Wright, who joins us from Paris-based Institut Montaigne, where she is a senior fellow and director of the Europe program. Georgina studied at the University of Edinburgh and the College of Europe in Brugge. She's also a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and an associate of the Institute for Government in London, where she worked before. She also worked at the at Chatham House, in London as well. So both of these fine institutions are based in London, and as you may know, one of the new ministers, Catherine Colonna, the new foreign minister in the French government, was the French ambassador to the UK until recently, and so I'm very curious, Georgina, to hear what you can tell us about Ms. Colonna in particular. Second, I welcome my esteemed colleague Shahin Vallée, who is head of DGAP's Geo-Economics program. Shahin used to be a senior economist at Soros Fund Management. He worked very closely as a personal advisor to George Soros as well. And most interestingly, in the context of this morning's briefing, Shahin worked as an advisor to Emmanuel Macron back when he was heading the Ministry of the Economy and Finance, Bercy, where Shahin focused on European economic affairs. He also worked as the economic advisor to the former president of the Council, European Council, Herman van Rompuy, a role that put him at the heart of the European debates in the tumultuous years of the Eurozone crisis around 2012. And I'm thus particularly interested, Shahin, what you expect from the old and new Minister of the Economy, Bruno Le Maire. Now, before we get into the discussion, let me give you a very brief roadmap on how we will proceed. I would like to start with some broader questions around the new government before taking a closer look at some of the nominations and the debates that have already unfolded in France since these nominations were made public. And we will then finish with an outlook on what the new government could mean for France's partners abroad in the coming 5 years. We will try to stop our discussion at around 9:15 to leave some room for your questions to our speakers. Now, Shahin, I would like to start by asking you. You have worked for the French government, as I have said, for Emmanuel Macron back when he was a minister at Bercy. Macron's ministers have traditionally been recruited from the ranks of the ministers in France have traditionally been recruited from the ranks of parliament, not so much under the French Republic and even less so under President Macron. Now Elisabeth Borne is said to have this very technocratic profile. She didn't run for office. There's some ministers, as I said before, who are running in the current elections. But this ideal type of a French minister, of a prime minister, has changed. So is it fair to say that Elisabeth Borne is a typical technocrat? And what does that mean for Macron's second mandate?
Yes, I think this is often said as a criticism in the eyes of many. I don't think this stands so much as a criticism in the eyes of Macron, being a technocrat himself, and having actually criticized repeatedly in the past what he described as the cursus honorum of French politics, which had politicians start as local officials, either mayors or others, then becoming members of parliament, and then finally becoming ministers with the hope of becoming presidential candidates for many of them. So I think Macron was very critical of that path, said that actually it led to inertia, and that in many cases it was a source of conservatism. So I think Macron is very comfortable with the fact that Elisabeth Borne is a technocrat, even though this is viewed by some as a criticism. Elisabeth Borne herself might be less comfortable with that, and that's why she's running for a seat as a member of parliament, even though she will not actually sit in the parliament even if she's elected. And a number of those technocrats, not all technocrats, by the way, some are not technocrats, some were business leaders and others who have been appointed by Macron in the last government, are all seeking a seat in parliament. But I don't think they're necessarily doing that out of Macron's demand that they do that. They're doing that themselves out of a need to seek some democratic legitimacy, but also maybe out of a need to prepare for the future, because you haven't said that, but this is actually Macron's second, but also last term. And as soon as this mandate has started, plans for the future are starting in the heads of many. And I think that will be an important dynamic in the next National Assembly. A lot of the parties, even those that are allies of Macron, are already preparing the ground for the future presidential bid in 2027.
Thank you very much. And I would agree. I mean, there has been ample speculations about Horizon, for instance, a party or movement, again, that was founded by President Macron's former Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe, who's now part of the presidential majority, but who, according to media, was not very satisfied with the number of seats he finally got for the upcoming elections. So that might certainly be something to look at in the coming years. Georgina, to come back to Elisabeth Borne as the new prime minister, as said in the introduction, she was expected to be nominated from the very beginning, but it still took 26 days, a very long time for the French politics, actually the longest in French history or in the history of the Fifth Republic, for Macron to choose her. What are the reasons that it took so long, and why did Elisabeth Borne did not surprise anybody in the end?
It's an excellent question, and thank you, Jacob, for having me, and thank you to DGAP. I mean, we can only speculate because, as Shahin and I often say, you know, only Macron really knows what's happening, and he keeps his cards very close to his chest. But what we're reading in the press and what you hear in Paris is that he had considered Elisabeth Borne fairly early on in 2022 as a potential prime minister, but as we came closer to the first round of elections, there was this sense, you know, there was talk at some point that he might not even make it into the second round. He was very criticized for being arrogant and a technocrat and far removed. And so there was a sense that he started exploring other options. You know, the sense that he wanted a woman, that was for sure, but he was potentially looking for more charismatic women. And there are a number of names that have circulated. There are rumors that he did actually ask a few women whether they wanted to be prime minister, and they refused. And why is that? Because, you know, the prime minister is going to run and lead the campaign for Macron's alliance in the legislatives. I mean, Macron's already pushed the boundaries slightly, but this isn't up to the president. This is up to the prime minister. And, you know, there were questions about whether she could effectively do this, given that she's never really had, you know, stood up for public office before, and any kind, and that she's not particularly charismatic. She doesn't have vaulting ambitions, but she does have links to the left, and she's hardworking, she's a woman. People do sort of know who she is, although there was an interesting poll that said sort of 23% like her. I think it was, you know, 27% don't, and the rest don't really know who she is. But she is, you know, she was Minister of Labour. She played a number of roles during the Macron 1 mandate, and so people sort of know who she is. And I think Macron, although he was looking for someone, you know, charismatic between sort of the first and the second round, he eventually came back to his first idea for someone who is hardworking, who has links to the left, because that's important in the parliamentary elections, but also someone who can trust. And when you look at the Borne government, this is a Macron government, right? Most of these people we know about, they're technocrats. They represent all of his priorities that he mentioned during the campaign, but also throughout his first term. And the question is, will she deliver? I mean, I think we can safely say that Macron will win his majority. It won't be as big as the majority as he got in the first term, but I think we can sort of expect her to pull through. And already she's, you know, in the news, sort of on radio shows every morning. You're hearing more of her. She's presenting the government's ambitions, so she's taken to the role very quickly. But I suspect, why was it a long time waiting and finding out who it was? Because Macron simply hadn't made up his mind and possibly did approach other people, but they said no.
Thank you. And maybe to follow up on this, and I would like to ask both of you, Macron took great care in his winning speech on April 28th to underline that his second mandate would not be a continuation, that he wanted it to be a new mandate with a new electorate, to give a new impetus to his second term. And many, or well, all of the commentators expected this choice of the new prime minister to be a first signal in that sense. Final question on Elisabeth Born, again to you both, and maybe Georgina, you want to start. Is she really, will she be capable of representing this new renaissance, this new tone for a second term, or is she too much associated to the first term? You said that she was a Minister of Labour.
So I don't think people see her as new. I think they definitely see her as a continuation from the first term. But in a sense, you know, we can only really answer that question after a couple of months or even, you know, a year into the job. I mean, her extreme challenge, her first challenge will be to deliver on a majority during the legislative elections in June, and her second will be able to kind of build coalitions and really deliver on this very ambitious agenda. You know, I think we'll come to it, but energy transition, and, you know, ecological transition, as they call it. There are a number of things that they're trying to do in galvanizing support at the in the territoire, so basically within the regions, at the local levels. There are lots that they're going to have to battle inflation and rising energy costs. So in a sense, people I talk to at least feel that she will be able to kind of coalesce and bring people together, which is effectively going to be needed if they are to deliver on the highly ambitious agenda they've set out. But I think the proof will be in the pudding. We'll just have to wait and see how she performs.
Thank you. Shahin, if you want to complete or come in on that question.
Yeah, I don't think very many people expect, even though the presidential party has been renamed Renaissance, I don't think very many people expect a radically different set of policies or radically different politics. I think the important departure, and in that sense, Elisabeth Born is a good symbol. The important departure is that, unlike in 2017, where Macron needed to appoint, or felt that he needed to appoint, a right-wing prime minister, this time around, he has neither appointed a left-wing prime minister, and there were some rumors before Elisabeth Born came to the fore of a couple of women that Macron had approached who were from a previously socialist or left-leaning background. So he's neither appointed a left-wing prime minister, neither a right-wing prime minister. And I think that's an important message to the public, and also an important message ahead of the legislative election, which is that the transformation of French politics is progressing, and Macron does not need neither the left nor the right to form a majority government. And I think that's of course a declarative statement, because we will see if that's the case after the legislative election. But I think the idea behind this appointment is also to campaign on the basis that Macron can govern alone. And in fact, the motto of the campaign and the motto of every candidate is, I am running so that Macron has a majority. It's not, I am running because I care deeply about this issue, or I am running because we want to be able to implement this program. It's, I am running so that the president can do what he wants. And I think that's an important message, which is completely in line with the Fifth Republic, and completely in line with Macron's use of the Fifth Republic's institution, which is a very executive, top-down, and somewhat unipolar way of doing politics.
So, as you said, and as you said as well, Georgina, first task for Elisabeth Borne and her new government will be to get this majority at the Assemblée Nationale. But then there's a couple of big questions, reforms for the second mandate for the next 5 years that I want to come to now. And I would like to start with you, Shahin, and talk about the ecological transition that Georgina already mentioned. Many expected the new prime minister as well as the new government to send a very strong signal in that direction, since the topic of the fight against climate change, the ecological transition, the greening of the French economy, the European economy, featured very high on the priority list for many French voters, but did not play a great role in the presidential campaign. The Greens and other parties were struggling to defend its importance, still are, I guess, in times of high inflation and rapidly rising energy prices. What do you expect in this regard from Elisabeth Borne? Let's say that once the majority has been defended at the Assemblée Nationale, and why has this fight against climate change, this program has been split up in a sense between two ministers, Agnès Pannier-Runacher, Minister for the Ecological or the Energetic Transition, sorry, and Amélie de Montchalin, who is heading the Ministry of the Ecological Transition. What's the plan behind that?
Thank you. No, I mean, very early on, Macron had announced two things. One was that his prime minister would be a woman, and the other that the prime minister would be directly in charge of the ecological transition. And it's true that the setup that has been announced with this government is somewhat different, in the sense that, you know, on paper, the prime minister is directly in charge of ecological transition, but it's true that then the work has been split between two ministers. I think there is a logic to this split. The question will be whether there will be enough collaboration between these three women to organize a cohesive and coherent transition. But I think for the French, the energy aspect of the transition, and that really involves managing basically the relationship between the state and EDF, which is the main electricity provider in France, and which is the company that effectively has the responsibility for the nuclear power plants and for nuclear investments in France. So that's one aspect of the transition, which I think the French view as central and strategic. And another, which is the whole set of measures that are taking place, including at the local level. And this is why the role of Amélie de Montchalin is to think about transition, but also in charge of what we call the territoire. So basically, you know, the region. So I think that division of labor is sensible and could be quite impactful. The question will be whether this is actually, you know, organized in a way that maximizes the effect of that transition. Maybe the slight issue I see with the setup is the European dimension of the ecological transition, because as we are seeing now, especially with the war in Ukraine and the transition that is taking place, for instance, with the REPower EU plans and things like that, I think the European dimension of the ecological transition will be critical, and it's not clear in this triumvirate who will be the interlocutor of say Robert Habeck in Germany, and so I think that's, to me, maybe the weakness of this setup, is that we don't have one single point of entry for our discussions about the green transition in Europe. You know, is it going to be Clément Beaune mostly in charge of that because he runs the European Affairs Ministry? Is it going to be the economy minister because there is a critical economic dimension of this? Is it going to be one of the two women in charge of the two ministers in charge of transition? Is it going to be the prime minister directly? So I think that creates a bit of a confusion as to who is the interlocutor on the European stage for that, and that to me might be the weakness of the setup, especially at a time where it's pretty clear that the EU is evolving towards giving the Energy Ministers' Council probably a much bigger role in European affairs, given the importance of energy in the current economic and political environment.
So, in a sense, a reflection of the debates we have in Germany between the Chancellery, the economic ministry with Minister Habeck, and then climate foreign policy and Minister Annalena Baerbock, who's really in charge, who will be in charge, leading the negotiations on the European level. Thank you for that, Shahin. Georgina, I want to turn to two names that have surfaced these past days, specifically two choices in the new government that have caught considerable media attention. I would like to begin with the new Minister of Education, Pap Ndiaye, who has often been described as the most surprising and newest, in a sense, in this in this first government of the second term of Mr. Macron. Is he a signal for the opening of Macron's second mandate? The president announced that education will be one of the major axes for his second term, that he wants to focus on education policies. Or is this new minister also a course correction with regards to the first term, with regards to Minister Jean-Michel Blanquer, whose fight against wokeism and Anglo-Saxon influence in the French debate was very controversial at times? What's your reading of Pap Ndiaye, please?
Thank you, Jakob. Just to quickly bounce off something that Shahin said on the triumvirate and how it's all going to work together. I mean, I see that also in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we can come back to it, but how there are different pieces of the puzzle, but it's not entirely clear how they're going to fit together and how the coordination is going to work. And that's why I think Elisabeth Borne's second challenge is very much going to make sure that everyone's clear on what their priorities are, that there's sufficient coordination and consultation, which, is not always a kind of strong suit from the French administration. So it's really going to have to get the ministers to know what their roles are, but also all the people working for them. So it's going to be an interesting challenge. On Pap Ndiaye, I think he was one of the most surprising appointments of the French government. So relatively unknown, he didn't really have much of a public profile, although those who are interested in what he was researching, so particularly race politics, but also a lot of thinking around research and how you make research work effectively. I mean, he was at Sciences Po, so he's not completely unknown, but I think to the broader French public, he was fairly unknown. And people are sort of torn between quite excited, those who think, oh, actually, he's going to be a new face for education, and he has experience, he's worked within, or at least at the highest levels, university, so he has sort of practical experience, which will be necessary, versus those who are sort of very critical and think that he's completely the wrong person, who have quickly picked up on the wokeism, who said that he is going to be a champion for wokeism, and wokeism has I mean, it's really surprising to see how the debate is in France. It sort of feels like it's years behind the debate in the United States and even other countries in the EU. But I think,
we discussed this briefly, but particularly fierce attacks as well from the extreme right, from the Rassemblement National very quickly.
Yeah, exactly. And so you have those who are excited, those who are slightly concerned, and then you've got a sort of smaller minority of people who have been openly critical, but I think possibly on racial / racist grounds. And it was quite vicious over Twitter, and I know Twitter's not sort of everything, but it was quite vicious to see how people were responding to his appointment. But I sort of spoken to people who know him personally and say he's very nice, that actually at Sciences Po he was really able to kind of put forward new and innovative projects, bring people on board. So it appears that at least from a sort of human and personal and interpersonal perspective, he's very nice. The question will he be too nice? Because, you know, in a ministerial position, you also have to sort of fight your ground. You're going to have to justify why you want, you know, money being poured into certain projects. And also education, as you said, Jakob, is a really big topic. In France, there are all sorts of questions about the very fundamentals, the values that are being promoted, to the way that it is being structured, to pay for teachers. How do you adapt to a new era, you know, post-COVID, where you could potentially make use of virtual platforms? There are lots of key questions and being posed at the moment, and education is something that concerns everyone, whether or not you have children. And I think he's got a mighty challenge in front of him. But what I hear is that he might be the right person for the job. But again, we'll have to see.
Yes, I'm always surprised as a German looking at the French debate how important this debate around what constitutes a Republican education actually is. And I guess in the next 5 years, as Macron has made this a priority, it will be even more important. Shahin, I want to quickly turn to a second name that surfaced over the weekend for unfortunate reasons, but I want to touch upon it briefly, also to have your view on what consequences it could have on Prime Minister Born's new government, but also on the campaign. Damien Abad, who is Minister for Solidarity, Autonomy and the Disabled, who's also a former conservative, Les Républicains, that Macron managed to pull into his majority, into his government, who's now the only former Les Républicains minister, so who's quite a symbol also going into the legislative. Abad is now accused of sexual violence, even faces allegations of rape, although there's no judiciary procedure running right now, as is my understanding. There has been a lot of talk about this over the weekend, and still. So the affair and these rumors risk or are already overshadowing the beginning of Ms. Born's new government. The first minister meeting was very much put second after these speculations. Now I want to ask you, Emmanuel Macron is known for his solidarity with his inner circle, that he protects people around himself, even if they get into these kinds of affairs. There's a number of examples. Do you expect him to give into the media pressure that is mounting, to pressure coming from his own ranks at times as well, or will he keep Abad and let justice do its work?
This is a very interesting and important case because there is indeed somewhat of a bifurcation in French society about the way we approach these sexual or sexist violences broadly in society, but in particular in politics. I think for a long time, the French were very accepting of these practices. And I think there is a real profound change, which actually, you know, started in the movie industry with the Me Too movement, but I think is now broadening, and there's something called the Me Too politique in France, with actually a real body of people fighting very hard to end sexual abuses in politics. I think what's very interesting is to note the difference between how Macron and the presidential party has approached the issue and how other parties have in the recent past. There was another quite similar case just a couple of weeks ago, inside the left-wing alliance that you have mentioned, the NUPES, where a candidate had also been accused of pretty similar facts, either sexual, sexist violence, or potentially a rape. And actually, the party, over a period that took no more than 3 days, decided to suspend this person named Taha Bouhaf, and to withdraw him from the general election. And there was quite a debate around this, whether it was right for a political movement or a political party to take such a strong decision in the absence of a legal fight and in the absence of a decision by a judge. And here you can see sort of a double standard emerging, because a lot of people were criticizing this left-wing party for having been slow to react, and others were saying that it was too strong a decision in the absence of a legal decision and the absence of the opportunity for the accused to also defend himself before a court. Macron had faced similar issues in the past with 2 ministers, with his current interior minister, Gérald Darmanin, who has also been accused of rape, and with his justice minister as well, who has been accused of abuse. And in both occasions, his line was, so long as there is no legal condemnation, so long as there is no trial, I am in no position to take a decision to sanction the individual in question. And it seems that Macron is going down the same path when it comes to Damien Abad, which is basically, and this was also the line taken by the prime minister, which is, there were cases brought before the justice. These cases were rejected. So, and I think Born was a bit careful. She said, in the absence of a new legal case, then there is nothing I would do. What's interesting, and I think it's been pointed out by a number of observers and journalists, and in particular feminist movements, is that there's really a weird double standard taking place, because it was common practice that from the moment that a minister was charged, not that he was condemned, that he was charged, he should step down. And the argument was that, you cannot run your political function and you cannot prepare your defense as you sit in a political office. And strangely enough, this doesn't seem to be the case for sexual violence, which has created a weird double standard. So if you're accused of corruption, or if you're accused of some malpractice of any kind, you should step down. But if you're accused of sexual violence, then you wouldn't. So I think the real critical question, given this practice, is in the next few weeks whether one woman or other goes and presses charges against Damien Abad. If that is the case, which I think is very likely, then it will become very hard to sustain him in the government. And so my expectation is that from the moment that there's a new legal case brought against him, regardless of whether it is judged or not, I think the pressure on him to step down will be very, very hard to resist. And maybe if I can add one word on Pape Ndiaye, because I didn't say anything on that before.
One word, please.
Yeah, just one word. I think it's a very important symbol, because Jean-Michel Blanquer, the previous education minister, was really embodying a particular line in French politics, and in the very tense debate around identity politics in France. He was really embodying a very pro-laïcité line, to the point of basically sometimes using laïcité in areas that are not supposed to be governed by laïcité. And so I think Pape Ndiaye's appointment is viewed as correcting that course, and I think it sends a very important message of where the president really sits on these issues, because he had been very quiet in the last term and had let people like Blanquer, people like Marlène Schiappa, and a few others to basically, drift the party line to something that I don't think was the line of the president himself. And I think that's a correction course, which is very meaningful.
Thank you. So after discussing these new names, maybe I would like to turn to some names who haven't resurfaced in the new government. Let's try to keep it short, though, to have a time. We already have questions, and I would encourage our public to think about more questions to ask our speakers. In the meantime, I would like to ask you, Georgina, why do you think Jean-Yves Le Drian, the former foreign minister, and Florence Parly, the former defense minister, why do you think they are not part of this new government, since they were both seen as very important ministers, as in the case of Parly, a very well-liked minister in the armed forces? And maybe a second question following up, what can we expect? I said in the introduction that Catherine Colonna, the new foreign minister, used to be ambassador, French ambassador to the UK. You might have crossed her in London. What can we expect from her, and with regards to French foreign policies in the coming years, months and years?
Okay, great. Thank you for those questions. Maybe let's start with Catherine. Well, Jean-Yves Le Drian, former French Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs. I mean, there were rumors that he wanted to leave government. The question was, would he stay at least until the legislative elections, and then possibly would he stay on a bit more for the Ukraine crisis? Because, of course, his real expertise is on defense matters, military matters, and actually overall people think that he's done a pretty good job. And so there were questions whether he'd stay on for a little bit, a bit like Florence Parly, and then change. Well, it turns out that that's not the case, but I think no one in France really expected Le Drian to continue doing 5 years, and that was pretty sure. Florence Parly, I was kind of surprised, in the sense that I thought, as you said, she's fairly popular, she's done a good job, you know, also a female at the head of the defense ministry, which was also an important symbol. And I don't know, I don't have the answer as to why she left. It might have been Macron who decided not to kind of ask her to stay on, or it might have been a personal decision. Maybe Shahin knows a bit more about that. On Catherine Colonna, I think the first thing to note about the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs is that you now have Catherine Colonna as the head minister, but you also have Clément Beaune, who's basically got a promotion. And there were rumors that he wanted to do the job that Gabriel Attal, the former French government spokesperson and now budget kind of junior minister. So there were rumors that Beaune wanted to do that he wanted to be responsible for the budget, partly because he wanted to get more recognition across France. Because if you're Minister for Foreign Affairs, or you work in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you can do as many sort of radio shows that you want in the morning. People don't always know who you are as a, sort of your education minister or of course finance minister, then you're more readily identified. So there are rumors that maybe that's what he wanted to do. Again, as Shahin was saying, thinking about 2027, positioning yourself, etc. But what I hear is that Macron wanted him to continue working on Europe because he's been a very effective Europe minister, but he got a promotion. But we don't really know what that means. Like, what is going to be his exact role? As Shahin said, is he going to sort of be the French government representative on all EU issues? Probably not. So today there's a EU Council, I think on agriculture, and it's the new French agricultural minister that's going. So there are lots of questions about what the roles are going to be, and then who does Clément Beaune kind of, is his boss Catherine Colonna? Does he sort of report more readily to Emmanuel Macron? It's unclear, and I think we'll have to see how the pieces of the puzzle come together. But it also, for me, signals by the appointment of Catherine Colonna and Clément Beaune that Europe is going to remain a key dossier for Emmanuel Macron and for the Élysée. So the Élysée is going to be readily involved in all of that. And the fact that Emmanuel Macron trusts Colonna, trusts Clément Beaune, gets on well with them, will help, hopefully, the flow of communication as well. On Catherine Colonna, I think she's, you know, for the Quai d'Orsay, there were a number of measures that were taken over the past year, including this kind of decision to sort of abolish the diplomatic concours that went down really badly. And so the fact that Macron was appointed a career diplomat is probably a good thing. And I think I've spoken to a number of diplomats and a number of officials in the Quai d'Orsay who say, you know, she understands how the machine is oiled, she understands how we work. And so there's a sort of a little bit of reassurance there. She's also, you know, was spokesperson for, I think, the Shahin government for longer than any spokesperson has been in that role. And she was, you know, the reputation of being mightily effective in her communication, being very on top of the dossiers, being very good at the technicalities, and also surrounding herself by a very good team. And so there are rumors about who her director of cabinet is going to be. I probably shouldn't say it now, but basically someone who sort of really understands. She's been kind of part of Le Drian's cabinet, but not in a top role. And she's going to pull really good people around her. So I think we can expect her to be highly effective. In her role as ambassador to the UK, I mean, there were two people that irritated the British government more than anyone, and maybe three if you count Macron, but it was Clément Beaune and Catherine Colonna. So these appointments have not gone down particularly well in London. I think Liz Truss, the British Foreign Secretary's kind of congratulatory tweet message was very much, we look forward to working with you on Ukraine. And I was thinking, is that really the extent of the bilateral relationship? So, you know, Liz Truss has already asked Colonna in several times to explain certain decisions or certain comments by the French government on anything from fisheries to migration. But overall, I think they probably do have a good working relationship, and they know that they'll have to deal with whoever is in charge. But I think we can expect Colonna to be, you know, at least very loyal to Macron, to really try and push and implement his agenda, and to be an extremely shrewd and effective communicator. The question is, how does she work with Clément Beaune? Who's boss? Technically, Colonna is Clément Beaune's boss, and then what's the role of the Élysée? So we'll have to see.
Thank you for this very extensive answer, complete answer as well. Shahin, I have to ask you at the very end as a last question before opening up, and again, please try to keep it short, but Bruno Le Maire has been reconfirmed as Minister of Economy and the Finance. He was crucial in the negotiations for the Recovery Fund, worked very closely, for instance, with the former finance minister on the German side, now Chancellor Olaf Scholz. What do you expect his role to be? You recently wrote that the window of opportunity to push for more European integration with regards to economic and finance policies, with regards to new common debt mechanisms, is closing in Germany. Do you expect Bruno Le Maire to kind of, will he be able to change this course in the coming months, for instance, in the Franco-German relationship as well?
So the very quick answer to that is no. And no, not because of the individual merits of Bruno Le Maire, but because these issues are Chefsache. So, you know, the question is whether Macron will push for them and whether the bilateral relationship between Macron and Scholz allows for it. At this point, I don't see a lot of room for it. My intervention about the window closing in was mostly about the case for fiscal rules. And that, I think, sadly, that debate has not progressed in Germany enough for us to have a big movement on fiscal rules reforms. And that maybe going back to Le Maire, because this was your question, that I probably regret a little bit that Bruno Le Maire hasn't fought a bit harder to put on the table a reform of the fiscal rules proposal. You know, I think the view in Paris was that, you know, the Germans are not ready, so let's not come up with something that will make the Germans uncomfortable. And as a result of that, we've lost quite a bit of time. The issue of fiscal rules was not heavily debated during the coalition agreement, not very much during the campaign prior to that. The French haven't pushed for it during the French presidency of the EU. And as a result, here we are a year later without having moved very much on the agenda. So I think the big worry I have is that, we have very changing economic circumstances, the need for probably more fiscal intervention, both at the national and at the European level, in particular in response to the Ukraine crisis. And we don't have the tools to do so. So I think the big question is whether Macron, newly elected and maybe reinforced after the legislative election, whether, a bold agenda will come up. And I think we can, hope that something will come up. His last speech in Strasbourg, I think, opened that window. I think the reception to that speech, whether in Berlin or in other parts of Europe, has been rather cold. And so it's not clear how, the window will stay open and whether Macron will have a lot of room for maneuver to move the needle there.
Well, thank you very much to both of you for these very insightful answers so far. The Strasbourg speech of President Macron is probably a good transition to our first question that comes from Dennis McShane, former UK Europe Minister. Mr. McShane, your question, please.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Just absolutely en passant, I worked very closely with Catherine Colonna when she was Chirac's porte-parole. She is excellent. She's a great French ambassador. She's got an LR party card, which is interesting. And also I'm interested that this President Macron is appointing ladies all much younger than me, but still over 60 to really big jobs in the French government. This is wonderful for the more mature person in politics. But I just want to make a political point, Jacob. And I was first stood for Parliament in 1974. I mean, I'm a political animal. And do Georgina and Shahin have any views on Macron's incredibly audacious attempt to create post-party politics in Europe? It is absolutely extraordinary. When Kurt Schumacher, the founder of the SPD after 45, came out of Belsen, he said, Deutschland muss ein Parteienstaat werden. Germany has to be a state based on parties, and all democracies, American, English, all democracies are based on parties as intermediary organizations between the citizens, come together, fight their fights, decide a policy, choose their candidates, and then put them to the voters. And Macron has just wiped that all away. He's reduced the socialists to nothing, the LR to nothing. But if there's nothing between La Rue and the Elysee, are you not worried that La Rue will replace a lot of political party work? And Jacob, you made the key point, and finish on that. This is Macron's last term. What is après Macron? Le président est mort, est-ce qu'il y a un fils, un dauphin? So this is going to be much heavier and trickier politics, I think, than any of us are imagining at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Whoever wants to start, if you both want to come in, please feel free.
Maybe very quickly, thank you, Dennis. I think this is a very important question. And to me, it's a slight disappointment. Macron in the last 5 years hasn't been able to build a party in France, let alone in Europe, while this was his clear objective. And it's true that this creates a potential void and a potential source of tremendous vulnerability for the time after Macron. Because indeed, it has been possible for him to exist politically without a party and to govern without a party. It might be a lot more difficult to transition from him to another leader that would emerge from his political environment without one such construction. So I think that's a very important source of weakness. He has 5 years to correct course, but I'm not sure he will. And I'm not sure he will in large part because he has been able to govern without it. And so I don't think he sees the need for a political party as much as we do sitting on the outside. So I take your point. I think that's a very important source of vulnerability. I think on the European stage, I would add that it's a source of weakness because with a bigger footprint in Europe through his political party, I think Macron would have a lot more leverage in Europe than he currently does. He has a lot of leverage today just by the sheer fact that he can, that he's kind of a towering figure in the European Council, and that's important. But I think that's simplifying European politics to the European Council. I think if Macron had a real network and a political party that would be Europeanized, which by now, after 5 years, could be very possible, he would be in a position, and I think the example of his last speech in Strasbourg, to avoid the fact that you pronounce a speech in Strasbourg at noon, and by 6 p.m. you have a statement by 14 member states rejecting your speech. I think if Macron had a political party and had built this European network other than through his own persona, I think these things would not happen.
Georgina, do you want to come in on the question?
I mean, Shahin has answered it perfectly. I think, for Macron, it's a party is a nice to have, not a need to have. And in a sense, if it helps him kind of achieve certain things, then great. But actually, he's proven that both at the national and EU level, he can do it. But Shahin's absolutely right. He's been heavily criticised for it, or at least it's been a consequence of many of the criticism. So if you think of his proposal for this conference on the future of Europe, which was this attempt to kind of do a massive EU-wide democratic exercise asking EU citizens directly what they wanted for the future of Europe. I mean, it irritated more than one MEP to say, well, why is he bypassing? Isn't that the role of the European Parliament? What's the role of pan-European party groupings? But I think Shahin is right that he knows this is something, hence why he's appointing ministers to think about territories and cohesion, and also trying with the group Renaissance in the European Parliament, the fact that he called his own sort of grouping Renaissance, trying to create a link there between the European and national levels. But yeah, nice to have, not need to have.
All right. Since I don't see a second question so far, I would follow up then, and would like to ask you. We quickly touched upon the fact that Edouard Philippe is already positioning himself within the presidential majority to follow in 27. He's largely expected to run for presidency in 2027. For those of us who still read Michel Houellebecq, Bruno Le Maire is a second candidate that might come in. How do you read this duel within the presidential majority, and will it affect Macron's second term? This time, Georgina, if you want to start.
Honestly, I think it's too early to say. Even if you looked at the beginning of the first Macron term, you wouldn't have really expected things to sort of pan out the way that they did. And I think the bigger question I have is what happens to the left. I mean, this coalition, NUPES, that you see between left-wing and sort of the Green Party, the aim really was to decrease differences between them. But already some MPs are saying, well, once we're elected to the Assemblée Nationale, we won't all stick to the same line. We'll revert to our party line. So what happens there? What happens with the Parti Socialiste? I mean, the chronology really matters as well. From what I hear, it was actually the Greens that approached La France Insoumise, so Mélenchon's party, to create a pact, whereas the Parti Socialiste wanted to first sort of look at what they could do with the Greens before going to the France Insoumise. So, and I think, at the moment, the NUPES, so this sort of left-wing coalition, are expected, I think, to win between 165 to 195 seats. And something like France Insoumise going from 17 seats to 100 to 150. Even if they don't win a majority, they're going to be disruptive. They're going to try and stall the government's agenda. And I think what happens there is going to matter hugely for what Bonn government is able to do, what Macron is able to achieve, and potentially then how other people who are looking at the 2027 election, how they position themselves as well. So I think, we really have to see. It's too early, but I would watch out what the left do first before looking at what Edouard Philippe and Bruno Le Maire do. So
we are already slightly over time. Is there any more questions, or if Shahin, you want to come in on this question of succession, or?
A quick word, because I think the succession war will actually start very soon. As soon as the legislative elections are passed, And as soon as we have basically, a government confirmed, which, minus a few changes will stay more or less the same for the next few years, I think the race for preparing for the next campaign will start. I take the point of Georgina that we need to watch what's happening on the left. I think what's happening on the left is likely to take longer to emerge because of the towering figure that Mélenchon is, and because of the sort of holdout that he will be able to engineer through the NUPES alliance. So I think we will know more actually about what's happening on the right, because Edouard Philippe will, I think, be positioning and angling himself as a successor quite early on, Bruno Le Maire potentially as well. That being said, it's, I think, useful to be reminded that 5 years before 2022, we thought Xavier Bertrand was the lead contender to be running for the right wing, and so there was lots of ups and downs, and it ended up being Pécresse, which had quite a low chance of being a candidate a few years before. So I think the field is very open, both on the left and the right, and it's precisely because the field is very open that it's going to be very hard to read until the very last moment. And I think what will matter tremendously is whether Macron will be playing a role in that, in the sense that he could hand over or prepare a transition to somebody else. And my personal view is that Macron is very unlikely to do that, and if he does, it will be probably at the last minute and probably too late to secure the job to that person.
Thank you. I see that Milan, a colleague here at DGAP, has a question as well. Please, Milan.
Hello, good morning. I know we are over time, but I wanted to ask about the appointment of the new defense minister, in the context that one area of the European policy where France was very ambitious to drive the whole EU debate was defense. It's more important now after Ukraine. But my impression from your debate is that this is the whole government and so on is very much inward looking to also the appointment of the new minister, Le Cornu. It's not somebody strong who could drive EU debate. So what do you expect?
No, I think that's a very fair criticism that this is an inward-looking government, but I think for a simple reason, which has been true even in the previous government, which is that all of the outreach is coming from the top. And so I don't think Macron is expecting Le Cornu to basically, negotiating a great European deal or to move the debate on European sovereignty and to be a partner that will, tilt the debate in Brussels or in Berlin. I think the view is that this is Macron's job to do and that he does it well, so he doesn't need other people to do it. I tend to disagree with that. I think this is a job that is so complex, so long, that actually requires a large number of people doing it at the same time and doing it in a coordinated way. But I don't think that's the view in Paris. So I think Macron will basically rely on himself and on Clément Beaune to a large extent. I tend to think that Colonna, despite her credentials, is not going to be central to this endeavor, but I might be wrong in that. And so the view is that with this team, you can do a lot, and there is no need to multiply the channels of transmission. I think this is a mistake, but this is the way it has worked in the last 5 years, and I think this is the way it will work in the next 5 years.
Can I quickly, Jacob, say one word, which is I completely agree with Shahin. This is like Macron. It's a Macron government, right? It's not a Borne government, and he's appointed people that are loyal to him. And anything to do with the EU is very much going to be driven from the top. So don't expect Le Cornu to say something that's massively different from what Macron is saying. Also, I think Le Cornu was quite a popular figure within La République En Marche. So he was former Les Républicains and then was excluded and joined La République En Marche, and he's a trusted person from Macron. He did quite a lot to kind of try and mobilize the party, and so it's sort of also seen a bit as a reward for all the work that he's invested in trying to make La République En Marche something that resembles a party, because it's a nice to have, not a need to have.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Georgina. Thank you, Shahin. Thank you, dear listeners, for coming to us this early in the morning. Maybe a quick couple of points to resume the discussion. I keep in mind what you just said, Georgina, that this new government is clearly a Macron government, not a Born government, that this will will be seen through the decisions that are taken in different policy fields in the coming months, that the first task of this new government is to win a majority in the Assemblée Nationale, that this will be a first test for this new government as well. And then also the question that you touched upon, Shahin, and that was asked as well, the question, what comes next and how quickly these infights will emerge within the presidential majority, how quickly the question of what comes after Macron will impact his second mandate. We, I think, will follow these questions in the coming months closely. I would be delighted to continue this conversation probably after the legislative elections. But for now, I wish you a good working day in Paris, in Berlin, or wherever you are, and see you soon. Thank you.